Howdy doody folks. Today we're doing things a little bit different, but also kind of the same, and looking at a bunch of weird urban legends. But the thing is, today we're covering ones that are either 100% true or are speculated to be true by credible individuals. Also, to be fair, we're covering one that ended up looking true, but is probably still just an urban legend. Anyways, let me know if you want this Urban Legends That Turned Out to Be True series to be ongoing. I know a lot of other YouTubers have covered this before, and I thought I'd take a swing at the format too. Otherwise, just a quick reminder, I'm taking you on a journey across the USA, and your ticket is complimentary so long as you help a small YouTube channel out and like, subscribe, and comment if you're enjoying the journey. Otherwise, sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. In Pittsburgh, there's an urban legend of a haunted tunnel in South Park Township, a place just south of Pittsburgh, and that there, back in the day, an electrical worker had an accident. This accident disfigured him first, and then he would come to pass away. Now, it's said if you visit this tunnel, you can observe this so-called Green Man in all of his splendor, walking through the tunnel at night. He'll present himself as a disfigured individual with a glowing green face. His skin turned green from the accident. And this is his tunnel after all, so he chases away anyone who visits his eternal abode. This entity or ghost is referred to as Charlie No-Face or the Green Man. The thing is though, there's a kernel of truth to the tale of Pittsburgh's Green Man. And by a kernel, I mean most of the entire story is true. The real-life Charlie No-Face, or Green Man, was one Raymond Robinson, who as an 8-year-old child in 1918 or 1919 decided to climb a pole to see a bird's nest on the Murado Bridge outside of Beaver Falls, PA, a community to the north of Pittsburgh. This bridge was a trolley bridge, and also, because of this, carried electrical lines that ran between 1,200 and 22,000 volts. FYI, I looked high and low for bridges in the area, and I wonder if this accident may have occurred at this modern-day Pennsylvania Railroad Bridge in Beaver Falls. Anyways, while climbing, the young Robinson would of course make contact with the wire, and he would be electrocuted. He would actually survive this though, but in the process, he would lose his right arm, his eyes, and his nose. Due to this disfigurement, Robinson, who as an adult lived in Coppell, Pennsylvania, would spend daylight hours inside making wares to sell with his relatives. But at night, when the darkness made it more difficult to see his disfigurement, I suppose, it became his nightly tradition to take up a walking stick and go for treacherous walks along State Route 351. It was on these walks that Robinson would be seen making his way down the road, and over time he became a bit of a local legend, with folks searching for him along the road and gathering to watch him go by. Usually it's said that Robinson would shy away from human contact, but it's said when he did interact with others, he was nothing but polite and kind, and he would sometimes even accept a beer or a smoke from folks in exchange for a photograph. Ultimately, Robinson would no longer take these walks in the last year of his life, and would go on to pass away in 1985 at 74 years old. As I stated in this story's introduction, he would go on to become a local legend. And to this day, one of the tunnels that he frequented along Piney Fork Road in South Park Township, PA, is known as the Green Man's Tunnel because of this. In Flores, Indonesia, there's a legend of a creature referred to as the Ibu Gogo. These creatures were described in folklore as hominids who walked on two legs that were generally much shorter than people, with wide noses, large mouths, and hairy bodies. Throughout tales of these creatures, though, one eerie theme is similar. They could whisper or murmur, basically speaking softly in a language all to their own, and even sometimes repeat human speech in these soft voices. These soft voices and their ability of mimicry at times were used to lure children into the forest, where they would often kidnap them and try to cook them. That being said, children were generally wittier than these creatures and were usually able to get home despite being kidnapped. Now, historically speaking, experts generally wrote these stories off as interactions with monkeys or simple lore about the dangers of the forest for children. That is, until one ethnologist, Gregory Fort, a professor of anthropology at the University of Alberta who did his PhD at Oxford, proposed that tales of this creature, the Ibu Gogo, and those of the orang pendek, another local monkey-like cryptid, may have been based on tales of extremely old encounters between humans and Homo floresiensis, also known as the Flores man, an extinct hominid species who would have been about 3 feet tall typically. Between when they were first discovered in a cave in Flores in 2003 and 2015, partial skeletons of 15 of these species have been discovered. This theory is also supported by one linguist, John McWhorter. John McWhorter was studying the change in the human language used in Flores over time, and noted a, I quote, radical loss in complexity in the grammar in the past. He states essentially that this is not normal, occasional, or even rare, but rather pretty much impossible, as human language in basically every conceivable case has become more complex over time. That is, with one exception, when a population that speaks a language comes into contact with a population that does not, with this population that did not speak the native Indonesian tongue being Homo floresiensis. It's worth noting that Homo floresiensis would have been capable of speech, as they had very large temporal lobes, the part of the brain associated with the understanding of speech and hearing, and they also had folded and convoluted frontal lobes, a part of the brain implicated in higher cognition. Additionally, another creepy fact worth noting regarding this legend, in modern-day non-human primates, it's been noted that when they feel threatened, they occasionally whisper to one another. For instance, 2 tamarin monkeys' vocalizations were studied by Rachel Morrison and Diana Reese of the City University of New York, and they found that sometimes when the pair wanted to avoid being heard, they'd soften their voices and make noises less easily distinguishable that were only audible within a close proximity. In other words, these monkeys whispered to one another, just like the legends of the Ibu Gogo. Now, to be clear, this seems to be an urban legend that very well may be true, but we're still putting the pieces together. Individuals do sometimes disagree with the idea that memories of Homo floresiensis could be preserved in oral history, given the species lived about 50,000 years ago. However, there are actually many very old historical tidbits that we're beginning to realize actually occurred that have been preserved in oral history. For instance, Aboriginal myths regarding the rise of sea level at the end of an ice age have been preserved and dated to reference an ice age ending 10,000 years ago, and similar flood myths exist from similar time periods in the oral history of other races. In reality, assuming humans lived a pessimistic 25 years on average historically, Homo floresiensis was alive and well just about 2,000 people ago, so perhaps if back then fear regarding the whispers of Homo floresiensis was pervasive enough, it could have survived oral history all this time. So this one is sort of dark, I should warn you. But there are urban legends abound that folks that pass away, or sometimes pass away by their own hands if you catch my drift, specifically around Halloween, are liable to be mistaken for decorations. Often, when I was a kid, my friend's dad would scare me and my friends by directing our attention towards realistic-looking decorations in the neighbor's front yard, and he would tell us that it was a very real possibility that that decoration in front of us may in fact just be our neighbor. And the thing is, while in our case he was indeed joking, this sort of thing happens more often than you'd think. Perhaps the most notable episode of a body being mistaken for a Halloween decoration occurred in Frederica, Delaware in 2005, when in late October a macabre decoration was noticed on a Wednesday night next to a busy road passing through the town. Of course, with it being Halloween time, folks assumed it was indeed a decoration. Who could blame them? Therefore, this out-of-place decoration suspended 15 feet above the ground sat in a tree for hours. But then folks started to get a little bit suspicious, and some folks eventually inspected it and realized, whoa, this thing looks a little too realistic. Anyways, ultimately, it ended up being a real person, a 42-year-old woman who took her own life in her front yard. Now, if you think this ends here, no way, there are tons more cases like this. For instance, there was also an occurrence of this in early October of 2015 in Chillicothe, Ohio, when neighborhood residents noticed what they thought to be a Halloween decoration hanging from a fence. Sadly, it turned out that this was no decoration at all, though, and it was rather one Rebecca Cade, a 31-year-old local of Chillicothe. Ultimately, the responsible party was apprehended for this crime, but in short, if you can't tell, you may want to be a little extra careful next Halloween if you're walking near a Halloween decoration that seems a little too realistic. In Arizona, there's folklore that began in the spring of 1883, when two women who were alone in the Arizona territory would come to encounter some variety of monster. In this first encounter, one of the women, after leaving the house to grab water from a nearby spring, would erupt into screams, only to be found later by some men and the other woman who barricaded herself in her home after hearing the screams. When they went to inspect the slain woman, they found there were hoof prints all over the place, and these hoof prints were much larger than those of a horse. This event would be categorized by the coroner as death in some unknown manner, rather than murder. This would be followed just a few days later when some gold prospectors would wake up in the middle of the night to their tent collapsing on top of them, and the sounds of galloping running off into the distance. The next morning, upon inspection, they too would find giant hoof prints. This story of some large horse-like creature would grow out of its own skin quickly, and this creature would come to be described as huge, reddish-colored, and even devilish-looking. Locals supposed that it was some strange version of a grizzly bear, and rumors were spreading that if you pursued this creature, it would disappear as quickly as it arrived. Additionally, those cowboys that saw this creature and tried to lasso it would find themselves outmatched, and at least one cowboy nearly lost his life doing this. Heck, even those that shot at the creature found that their bullets apparently would pass right through the beast, or instead hit whatever the strange burden was that it carried on its back. Now, as for what this was, the creature was finally identified about a month after these rumors began going wild, and a rancher named Cyrus Hamblin near Salt River, about 80 miles north of the original sighting of the beast, would come across something out of place as he was looking for stray cattle. He was up in some hills, and he saw something below him that was slightly red, but also sort of familiar to him, a camel. Also, regarding the burden on its back, it was clearly a man, and a dead one at that. Ultimately, 10 years after the camel's first attack against the woman we mentioned at Eagle Creek, the final incident involving the so-called Red Ghost would occur. That's what they were calling this camel. This final battle against the Red Ghost involved one man, Mizu Hastings, who would awake in his gold camp on the San Francisco River, only to see the Red Ghost eating his turnips through the window of his cabin. Mizu would blast away, and finally, he would be the one to put down this urban legend once and for all. Now, this urban legend about a giant horse or grizzly bear or whatever that they were calling the Red Ghost that turned out to be a camel is great and all, but where did this camel come from in the first place? It's not like they've been native to North America for about 15,000 years, right? Well, the story is relatively simple. As Manifest Destiny was being realized in the USA, the military would end up purchasing 70 camels along the Mediterranean for about $30,000 because of their hardy nature and their ability to go longer without water than horses or mules. Ultimately, while this project was declared a success by some individuals within the military, if you actually read the accounts on this experiment, they're in equal parts sad and hilarious. As for the sad part, it seems servicemen and cowboys of the era were not so nice to their four-legged steeds like they're portrayed to be in movies. If they were dealing with horses, they could get away with a whip or two and a slap here and there, but camels wouldn't take this from the cowboys, and instead they would happily bite, trample, and spit on their captors when they felt wronged. Ultimately, most of these camels would be sold off, but in some cases they were allowed to escape because servicemen largely hated these creatures, which they considered inferior to the less easily trained horses. One of these camels, likely one that was released or that ran away on its own, would go on to terrorize the Arizona territory, playing the legendary role of the Red Ghost. In New York City, there's been an urban legend since the subway's construction in the 1800s that in the over 700 miles of tunnel running beneath the city, and often beneath your feet, it may not just be train cars passing below you, and in actuality, there are people living down there, people referred to as mole people. Legends say these people have adapted to their dark environments, and that they have eyes that can see in the dark, that they wear cloaks and masks to keep the dusty subterranean surfaces from touching their skin. Some even say their digestive systems have adapted to a new diet after dwelling in the sewers for so long, and that because of this they subsist on rats and occasionally their favorite delicacy, human flesh. And that they're picking their moment to rise up and take the surface from us. Now I get it. It is a scary prospect. These mole people were indeed the only ones we've seen capable of fighting toe-to-toe with Saitama up to this point, but in reality, the mole people do exist, and they aren't some other race of people. Rather, they're human beings that, due to their condition and the harsh reality of above-ground winters, have been forced underground. In New York City, many of these so-called mole people find themselves dwelling in abandoned underground encampments, in the so-called ghost subway stations, and also in abandoned rail cars. Usually, they find their way underground to escape the cold New York winters, or the harsh treatment given to them by locals above ground. These communities are apparently fairly tight-knit, and sometimes they do look after one another, but there's also a darker side to these below-ground communities, that there are hierarchies, and that when crime does occur in these subterranean groups, there's no below-ground police force to call for help, and the above-ground police force might also punish you, as making your way into the subways of New York City, while they're easy to access, is highly illegal. Additionally, underground there's no light, with only the sparse light from ventilation ducts and holes in the sidewalk being used to get around and read. Finally, access to food in the New York City underground is almost non-existent, so getting 3 square meals a day is no easy task. Ultimately, despite these challenges, it's estimated that over 2,000 homeless individuals have made their way into New York City's abandoned subways, and that as you're walking the streets of Manhattan, you may very well be walking over communities beneath your feet. So in Southampton in the UK, there's a bit of a rat problem. They're frankly everywhere. Now, if you've lived in any major and dense city, you'll know this is a problem. New York City and Boston, I'm looking at you. Anyways, for a long time, the locals of Southampton blamed this rat problem on some supposed mysterious individual who would wander the streets of the town at night looking for a secluded spot where he could feed the town's rats raw meat. Now, you might think this is silly, but as it turns out, Southampton actually did end up having its own little Pied Piper. Recently, locals have caught a man in photographs riding his bicycle with bags of bread hanging from the side, or sometimes grain. And shortly after these photos were taken, this same individual was caught on camera actually feeding this bread and grain to rats. Of course, in classic UK fashion, they're handling this situation. The Ratman has been warned that he'll be fined if the feeding of these rats continues, and he should be aware he's been identified. But locals note he doesn't really respect authority, and they suspect he'll continue to contribute to the rat problem in town that's at a multi-decadal high. Regardless, funny enough, the local suspicion that someone was feeding the rats, contributing to the exploding rat population in town, was indeed correct. In Liverpool, in the 1980s, there was a sort of urban legend of a boogeyman-like figure. These legends told of a strange man, the sort of character that, at least to me, is downright creepy. This man was described as huge and of African descent, and that he'd stop young men that were walking the streets of Liverpool late at night and ask them if he could feel their muscles, even measuring the dimensions of their muscles in some cases. The name given to this man was the Purple Aki, which was implying that his skin was so dark that he was purple, a nod to the fairy tale aspect of the story that suggested he may be more legend than human being. While most viewed this tale as folklore, many still came forward claiming they'd been approached by this man and asked to show him their muscles so that he could touch these muscles. And the thing is, these folks that reported seeing him, they were actually telling the truth. In reality, a Liverpool man was the Purple Aki. This man was born in 1961 in Lancashire and was of Nigerian descent. Here, he worked as a cleaner at the Mersey tunnels and as a messenger for Liverpool City Council. And he's been wrapped up in a ton of incidents, which presumably led to the urban legend surrounding the Purple Aki. For instance, in 2001, he was accused of 50 counts of indecent assault and harassment, and was jailed for 30 months for these. After this release in 2003, he didn't feel remorseful either, clearly, and went on to resume this strange behavior, being jailed again for 6 years after 15 more counts of harassment, and even some charges of witness intimidation were brought against him. Later, in 2008, it was even found that he had a stalker's manual of sorts in which he stored details about the people he'd touched in the past, including their measurements, and even their contact numbers and the addresses of their families. From this, folks learned that the Purple Aki would actually research his victims before approaching them, and he'd intimidate them into showing him their muscles, doing squats, and doing other strange things. This all resulted in a literal ban on the man touching people's muscles, a niche ban if I've ever heard of it. Frankly, this is the gist of it. I cannot really get into more details here, or YouTube is not going to be a fan of me, but the Purple Aki, a fictional monster, turned out to find its roots in this real monster. The worst part is, from what I can tell, he's still alive and kicking too, and possibly out of jail in Liverpool. In 2022, he was even awarded a large settlement from a civil case where he alleged that police officers made false allegations against him because of his race. Now, something we don't cover a lot on this channel is curses, and while there's no definitive way to prove it, there's at least one that, if you ask the good folks of Toronto, is definitely true. This story begins with William Bash and Bill Barilko, an ice hockey player who played for the Toronto Maple Leafs. Barilko was part of a historic ice hockey team with them, who won in 1947, 1948, 1949, and 1951, with Barilko actually scoring the game-winning goal in overtime in their April 1951 game against the Montreal Canadiens. This goal, sad as it is, would be the last that Barilko would ever score. Just 5 days after he scored this goal, he and his dentist, funny enough, I don't know if I'd ever hang out with my dentist, would board a float plane to go on a fishing trip. But on the way back from this trip, their plane would disappear along with the passengers. It's said that in lieu of his body being found, Barilko would curse the Toronto Maple Leafs. As suddenly as their hot streak had started, the Maple Leafs wouldn't go on to win the Stanley Cup in 1952. Nor 1953. Time and time again, they'd make it as close as the finals, but they'd never get all the way. That is until 11 years later, when a helicopter pilot named Rob Boyd would rediscover the wreckage of a plane, the plane that Barilko and his dentist were aboard. Funny enough, this discovery would occur just a couple of months after the Toronto Maple Leafs finally won the Stanley Cup again for the first time in those 11 years. Now to most, this is simply a coincidence and lives in the realm of fictional sports curses, but to some, this was way too coincidental, and proof that Barilko's passing and his lost remains had indeed cursed the franchise. And I guess anticipating that he'd be discovered soon, Barilko decided to give his team a break. Admittedly, I view this as the Maple Leafs actually kind of cursing Barilko to not be found until they won another Stanley Cup, but hey, forget the details. Whichever way this story goes, it's good fun, and in a funny roundabout way, it feels like this bit of folklore may just be true too. Back in the 1600s, there were legends told of monsters by Andrew Patel, an English sailor who was, at the time, captured by the Portuguese in West Africa. Anyways, Andrew would go on to tell tales of these monsters in West Africa that were eerily similar to humans, and these monsters would go up to the fire at camp in the morning when they thought that people had left. Specifically, he would call this animal a pongo, stating that it had proportions of a man but was like a giant in stature. He described the pongo as being tall, having a man's face, hollow eyes, long hair on its brows, and he noted that these creatures could never be killed as they traveled together and they were too strong to be held captive by men. In short, he would admit these appeared to be man-like apes, but at the time, this sort of creature likely elicited an image of a Bigfoot-like beast more than today's common apes to him. In a similar region, John Hanning Speke would tell of mountain ogres in the 1860s, who actually would go on to squeeze a woman to death in front of him. And in that same period, writing would be made by explorer Du Chaillu of bloodthirsty monsters in the forest of West Africa that were more than happy to attack any human they set their eyes upon. Of course, this cryptid that these early African explorers were discussing were the now well-known mountain gorillas of West Africa. Honestly, their descriptions were apt with the exception of the bloodthirsty portions. These creatures were extremely strong, and perhaps their affinity for beating their chests and their immense strength elicited fear in these early explorers who witnessed them. Heck, even knowing what a gorilla is, if I saw one within striking distance of me right now, I'd be very much inclined to get the heck out of its way. Regardless, the mountain gorilla, which is what these creatures were, would formally be discovered in 1902 by a German officer, one Captain Robert van Bringo, when he would sadly shoot 2 of these large apes, subsequently sending them to the Natural History Museum in Berlin, where they would be officially documented as a new species. Folks, I hope you enjoyed this dive into urban legends that turned out to be true. Again, let me know if you'd like to see another few of these videos. As it stands, I think I've got at least 1 or 2 more of these that I can cover from my research so far. Otherwise, if you did enjoy yourself, a like, a subscription, and a comment is always appreciated. In terms of channel news, I'm going to keep making these weird stuff videos I've been going at, and I'm hoping to make one about Tennessee actually, my home state, next, so stay tuned for that. Otherwise, whether you were taking a chill walk through the desert and saw a red camel barreling your way, or if your favorite hockey team just can't seem to win the Stanley Cup, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.